Well, welcome everybody to this event. It's lovely to have all of you who are here present in the room, and welcome to all of those of you who are in other rooms elsewhere on Zoom. It's the end of the semester and it's often a difficult time to get people together, but this is a very special event and I'm delighted to be able to introduce our speakers today for a discussion of Ernesto de Martino's Fine del Mundo. This is the nicest job that anyone gets to perform, the introduction of guests whom you adore and whose work has been an inspiration to you. So I'm very pleased to have this chance. But I would like to thank our collaborators to start with, the Society of Fellows at the Hayman Center for the Humanities to begin with, the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and the Department of Anthropology. And that nexus of institutional sites at Columbia bespeaks the interest and the cross-disciplinarity of the projects that we're going to address today. Translation is always a collaborative exercise, a spectral collaborative enterprise, perhaps in which translators are in some distant relationship with the authors and the texts to which they bring their translational expertise, as well as with the audiences who may read them. And in this case, as we'll learn, with the other translators who have been engaged by, allured by, stymied by the works that they take on. So today we have Dorothy Zinn and Jasmine Pisapia in conversation. Dorothy Zinn is professor of sociocultural anthropology at the Free University of Bozen-Bolzano. She originally trained here in the United States at the University of Texas at Austin, but has been engaged with both the anthropology of and the experience of the, I suppose, Italian language made world. Her work attends to questions of migration with a particular interest in the experience of migrant youth. Increasingly concerned with questions of gender-based violence as it affects migrant women in Italy, especially in southern Italy, and the southern question is part of her interest. She is the author of, I'm going to ruin this, but I will try nonetheless, as a gesture of respect, Raccomandazione, Clientelism and Connection in Italy, Migrants as Metaphor. And she is the translator of a number of works by deMartino, including The Land of Remorse, published in 2005, and Magic, A Theory from the South in 2015. She writes in a number of voices and for a number of platforms, including those that seek to reach a broad public. She is a regular editorialist with the newspaper Corriere della Sera for Trentino Alto Adige region. And she is here working on this enormous project, the project of a lifetime, perhaps, the translation of deMartino's last great work, a work in which he left behind the narrow concerns of anthropology for a philosophical, theological exploration of questions that she will discuss with Jasmine. Jasmine Pisapia is known to many people here because she completed her doctorate at Columbia in the Department of Anthropology less than 4 months ago, and has already assumed a postdoctoral fellowship at McGill University through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. She is there to work on and to help establish a new program in media anthropology, experimental media anthropology. She is herself a scholar of and reader of deMartino. Her dissertation concerned the lives and afterlives of toxicity of poison in Taranto, and has written a number of beautiful essays that cross genre and that seek to bring an ethnographic sensibility to the questions of our time. And I must say that having just been a fly on the wall, as these two have been working through the presentation today, I have watched the excitement and the intellectual engagement of their exchange with enormous pleasure, and I know you will enjoy that too. I'm going to stop saying anything more because you are here to hear them. And I believe there are slides and much more to come. But welcome, Dorothy, welcome, Jasmine. Thank you for being here. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I leave it to you.
Thank you. So thank you, and Rosalind, and good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I have many thanks to make, so please bear with me for one moment when I thank the Heyman Center for hosting us here today, this event. Also the other Columbia institutions that were already mentioned, the IRCPL and the ICLS, as well as the Department of Anthropology. And I really want to thank Rosalind Morris and Naor Ben Yehoyada in particular for the actual nuts and bolts work in getting the event off the ground. But more broadly, I really have to offer a word of thanks to the Department of Anthropology and in the person of Chair David Scott and Naor as the host for my stay here at Columbia as a visiting scholar and making it possible. The administrative people have been wonderful too in the office of the department. Zinn Abreu has generously shared her office space with me, and all of this has been really wonderful because, as you'll see, I've got a big project on my hands, and it's just so nice to be able to work comfortably. The Butler Library has become my second home, basically. And also a special word of thanks to Jasmine for the dialogues that we've been having, because it's been a lot of fun and really exciting. And I hope that we'll continue with that. But I wanted to open our event today with a concise intellectual biography of deMartino, just to contextualize who it is that we're talking about and give you, in case you're not familiar with him, give you a little background, and then we'll go. The rest of the event will be dedicated specifically to these questions of translation. I'm only going to hit his major works. Basically, it's going to be a very concise intellectual biography, but nonetheless, I think it'll help everyone have some bearing. So Ernesto de Martino, born in 1908, died in 1965. At the time that he was working on the book that I'm translating, The End of the World. He's been called by many scholars the Italian Claude Lévi-Strauss, basically in terms of his importance. Within Italy, he has such a kind of cult following, and people are so interested in his work, which is so broad. Within the humanities, there's a whole area of the study known as deMartinology, basically deMartinologia, just to say, that he lends his name to a whole area of study. But he basically would always define himself as a religious historian or an ethnologist. But as we'll see, he was also very much a philosopher. And in fact, a philosopher of the caliber of Paolo Virgno has called him one of the most important and original philosophers of the 20th century. He studied religious history first under Adolfo Omodeo in Naples, but then he was also influenced by another religious historian and archaeologist, Vittorio Macchioro, who would later become his father-in-law, but that's another story. He graduated the university with a thesis on the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, but then subsequently turned his attention to ethnology. He had a youthful and somewhat embarrassing nowadays enthusiasm for fascism, but got over it pretty quickly in the 1930s. He had seen fascism as this kind of civil religion, and this attracted him. But he was eventually drawn to the idealist, historicist, and philosopher Benedetto Croce, again from this Neapolitan group. Benedetto Croce, who had a significant political as well as intellectual influence on deMartino. So deMartino basically joined Croce's circle, Eventually, he moved further to the left politically, then Croce, joining the Italian resistance during the war. And then later, he was a member of the Italian Socialist Party and finally the Italian Communist Party. As we'll see, he was also very much a public activist and public intellectual. The first monograph that he published was Naturalismo e Storicismo nell'Ethnologia. And it was a bold armchair kind of monograph where he was trying to apply the lessons of Benedetto Croce in historicism to the field of ethnology. And he critiqued positivist ethnology that was dominant at that time in Italy. And in general, what he calls naturalism as studying human beings using the methods of natural sciences. He was very critical of evolutionist thinking, the Italian ethnology that was prominent at that time. But he also was saying that we need to bring historicism into the study of non-Western peoples, the so-called, as Eric Wolf famously called them, the people without history. But he was also critiquing the Viennese school, which was doing history, but in deMartino's view, it was really history in this very narrow kind of philological type of study. So this was a very, as I said, very bold work. It drew a lot of attention. Croce liked it somewhat, but he basically disapproved of the idea of applying historicism to non-Western peoples. I won't go too far into this, but Croce, by today's standards, had some very embarrassingly politically incorrect views about non-Western peoples. Anyway, the second monograph that grew after this one, he started immediately working on the second one, in Mondo Magico. He had the idea of doing a history of magic in human thought, in human life. In the book, it was such a big, ambitious project. He ended up focusing on magic in non-Western contexts. By the way, I do want to mention, because our focus is on translations today, in the lower right, you see the one English edition of this book, but I don't recommend it because it's a really problematic translation of Il Mondo Magico. And a lot of colleagues have urged me to do a retranslation. And so perhaps when I finish this and take a breath and recover, I'll get back to Il Mondo Magico. But it's an important book because you see a lot of central themes in deMartino's work that are getting off the ground here, that he extends all the way through the rest of his work till the end of the world. So how is he dealing with magic here? Well, it's not just something that complements, for example, Malinowski's idea of magic as ritualized optimism, or Evan Pritchard's work that recognizes the rationality of magic. No, deMartino goes even deeper epistemologically. He says that we need to take magic seriously, not starting from our Western premise that magic is wrong or just bad science. We need to consider the problem of the reality of magical powers. He's basically calling into question our own Western conception of reality. And what he's saying fundamentally is that researchers need to be aware of their own cultural categories when they're analyzing something. And it's a theme that returns very heavily in The End of the World. So when we talk about magic as a category, for example, even our idea of magic in the West bears with it centuries of sedimentation of polemics against magic in our approach. So I think it's really amazing, from the 1940s, deMartino is already providing a very sophisticated epistemological reflexivity. In this book, he has an early formulation of his notion of presence as a kind of ontological concept related to Martin Heidegger's Dasein, but not only. We can't reduce it to simply a kind of repetition of Dasein. There are other influences in there. I won't be able to go too far into this, but one of deMartino's points, which differs from Heidegger, is that presence is not something that's given. It's something that has to be achieved and remains fragile. And especially if you're living in harsh conditions of existence, as many of the peoples studied by ethnologists in the early 20th century were living, presence could very well be threatened and at risk, and become a presence in crisis, as he would say, a crisis of presence. The magician or shaman is a sort of hero in this context. And when he redeems himself by going through this crisis of presence and overcoming it, he is then able to redeem the other people in the community. And therefore it becomes this kind of heroic figure. The book was very controversial at the time. Not everybody understood what he was trying to do with it. And Croce in particular laid a very heavy negative judgment on it. And this kind of marked deMartino, but it also gave him this reputation as a real renegade thinker. And he continued to work on this idea of presence and presence in crisis, etc. But he moved away from the armchair study to finally doing field work. And he was doing a kind of anthropology at home and between the 1940s, 1945 and the 1950s. From 1945 to 1950, in that period, he was active as a leader of the Socialist Party in southern Italy, in the city of Bari. And while he was teaching at high school, by the way, because he was unable to get a university position. And in that period, he was traveling throughout the South as a political activist and was able to see the conditions of the Southern peasants, which were really dire. He continued with this work throughout the 1950s as he was a teacher in Rome and member of the Italian Communist Party. So he observed the precarious existence of the Southern peasants and how they used magic and various kinds of rituals to cope with their crises of presence. Out of this period of research, he created 3 monographs, the so-called Southern monographs, one on funeral lament, one on magic, and one on the ritual exorcism of Tarantism. I should note that he was treating classic folklore topics, and yet he wasn't using the approach in folklore that was dominant in Italy. In fact, he was very critical of the positivist school that was hegemonic under Giuseppe Pitrè. So deMartino completely changed the picture, bringing an ethnological attention to the study, historical study, but also a kind of sophisticated Marxist analysis coming out of his readings of Gramsci, who was published in Italy in 1948. The first of these 3 studies, the 3 Southern monographs, Morte e Pianto Rituale, which has not yet been translated into English, is a tour de force study of ritual lament, bringing together ethnographic study in Lucania, southern Italy, and Romania with historical investigation from the ancient Mediterranean world through to Christianity. deMartino talks about how the crisis of presence gets embodied in the subject that's in grief, mourning, and how that subject can recover through ritual lament. Which was a practice still in use in Lucania in the 1950s, despite the hegemonic ideology of the Catholic Church. Another element of the book that's very worthy of attention, there are a lot of photos from the ethnographic work and reconstructions, and then he has a kind of appendix he calls an illustrated atlas of lament with artwork depicting lament from the ancient world all the way through to the Renaissance, with various photos, and then also his ethnographic photos. And I say this because all 3 of the Southern works include a kind of what we call today a multimodal approach to ethnography, He's incorporating a lot of visual work with photography in particular. Some photographers who became extremely famous in Italy worked with deMartino. Sound, very famous ethnomusicologist Diego Carpitella collaborated with deMartino. And in fact, the first edition of Land of Remorse even had a record attached to it. So that was really, you know, amazing for thinking about that in the early 60s. The second of these Southern monographs is one that I translated in 2015, Su de Magia, and it's a study of various forms of magic amongst Southern peasants, the Lucanian peasants, continuing this exploration of a kind of phenomenology and existentialism in the idea of the crisis of presence and using ritual to treat it. Another element in the book that's, I think, worthy of note is the last part where he does a kind of historical studying up of the Neapolitan elites and how they developed the concept of yettatura, which is a kind of jinx belief. That also is really amazing, I think, for that time. But all of this attention that deMartino was placing on magic made him a bit suspect amongst some of his academic colleagues. They thought he was trying to bring in irrationalism. And this is very ironic because he was very dedicated to a rationalist tradition, this lineage from Giambattista Vico in Naples through Croce. And so he was very rooted in that. But also because he, as a historian of religion, he was very interested in engaging phenomenological thinkers, and yet he was very critical of them, people like Rudolf Otto and Mircea Eliade, because he felt that they got too close, that they were identifying too much with their objects of study. So he was always trying to navigate this difficult passage. In any case, as I was saying, there's the Marxist inspiration of Gramsci in all of his mature works, and deMartino had a complex relationship to Marxism and communist politics, both as an activist and an intellectual, but we could definitely say that he was a kind of Gramscian organic intellectual. In 1956, he left the Italian Communist Party, probably because of the invasion of Hungary, but he remained a very public intellectual, and he influenced a lot of left-wing artists and thinkers. He sought to communicate anthropology to a more general public, especially when he was trying to denounce conditions in Southern Italy. He published in popular newspapers and magazines. He did radio programs and worked with documentary filmmakers. The third of the Southern trilogy is The Land of Remorse, the first monograph that I translated. And this was a study of a culture-bound syndrome, tarantism, in Apulia's Salento area. And it's a foundational text for ethnopsychiatry in Italy. That was another one of deMartino's contributions. He basically examined this phenomenon of tarantism 360 degrees from various disciplinary perspectives and with a fantastic historical depth. In fact, he gives us a kind of archaeology of the discourse on tarantism. He talks about how therapeutic forms and their symbolisms based on shared cultural understandings have a kind of efficacy. And he also includes a lot of attention to performance and embodiment, issues that would become more current in Anglophone anthropology many decades later. All three of these Southern monographs develop in different ways his theories about symbols and rituals. And we could sum this all up with the expression that he uses, ritual dehistorification, as a way of safeguarding or recovering a presence in crisis. And I just want to note that an essay that he wrote, published in Out in 1956, is available in English translation, open access. And I note that on the slides for anybody who's interested. deMartino moved from the mondo magico, where he was looking just at non-Western peoples, to an idea, the crisis of presence is really something that involves all of us. It's not only people outside the West. This idea that presence is never permanently secured, and it can just take some terrible tragic event like the loss of a loved one to throw our presence into crisis and reduce the sufferer to a kind of passive, objectified existence. So that what he calls the mythical ritual apparatus offers us a kind of resolution, first on a meta-historical level, and it allows the sufferer to latch on to the myth and move through the ritual and move from a dehistoricized situation and back into history and regain agency. That's a real nutshell explanation of a very complex concept, but you can definitely get that if you check out that article. DeMartino really was very much an academic outsider. He developed his university career pretty late after being an adjunct of ethnology in Rome. He finally got a chair of religious history in Cagliari, Sardinia. He was a controversial figure in his time, not adequately acknowledged and quickly forgotten upon his death. However, from the 1970s on, new generations of anthropologists in Italy began to look at his work again, especially because they were interested in, again, the Southern question, but not only his whole Gramscian take on the dynamics of hegemony and subalternity on a cultural level. And finally, we arrive at his posthumous work, The End of the World, the work that I'm translating right now while I'm here, an extremely ambitious project that he left incomplete. It was his most philosophical work, where he's introducing concepts that have become famous in Italy, like critical ethnocentrism. And he has a whole philosophy of being here and the nature of culture, basically. The first edition of this in 1977 was reconstructed by Clara Gallini out of his notes in the archive, and she had a Herculean task doing that. But it was not, it was a bit problematic, and three other scholars came back in the last few years: Giordana Charuti, Daniel Fabre, and Marcello Massenzio, doing more research in the archives and producing a new edition that they argue is more philologically correct with respect to what deMartino intended. Of course, it is still a reconstruction or an interpretation of what deMartino wanted to do. They published this in French in 2016, with the Italian edition following in 2019, and that's what I'm working from for my translation, which should come out next year with University of Chicago Press. So deMartino, I won't go too much into the content here. I'll just say very, very briefly that he has, on the one hand, he's basically going into a very broad study of apocalyptic thought in mankind, humankind, spanning the apostolic Christian apocalypse in early Christianity to ethnological examples, so millenarian cults and eschatological movements of peoples following colonial contact and decolonization that was going on in the years that he was writing. His original idea was to include also Marxist apocalypse, and he does have a whole chapter on Marxism, but it doesn't really deal with the Marxist apocalypse, that is, the overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat kingdom of God. And finally, a large section on modern art and literature, which was of great interest to him. So he's putting these together as what he calls categories of cultural apocalypse, and contrasts them with another category, which he calls, I don't know why it's, the label's not reading. Anyway, it's psychopathological apocalypse. And for that, he's looking at literature from psychiatry, psychology, especially existential and phenomenological schools within psychiatry, and specific forms of mental illness. And he's comparing those forms of apocalypse to what we see in some of the other ones. And again, he wasn't able to finish it, but it's a very rich and inspiring work, even in its somewhat fragmentary state. When he was writing this, think about the fact that it was, hardly 20 years after the Shoah. We had the Cold War that was ongoing with the threat of nuclear war, decolonization, as I already mentioned, and all of this was in the background and comes out in the book. But also there's a glimmer of hope. I think we also have to keep in mind the context of the Second Vatican Council that was going on in those years. And so there are some passages in the book where there's a very ecumenical kind of spirit that reminds me of this kind of, Vatican II thing. So it's a book that's really amazingly contemporary for the issues that we're dealing with today in a lot of ways. Again, I won't go into this any further, but perhaps if there's specific questions in discussion, we can bring those up. I really want to leave time to focus on the main issue today, which is the actual work of translating deMartino. So thank you very much.
A little bit closer. Yeah.
Thank you, Dorothy, for this wonderful introduction to deMartino. And yes, so now we're entering the second part of this event. And I just really wanted to thank Naor and Rosalind for making this event possible. And in particular, Naor for arranging Dorothy's stay here in New York as a visiting scholar, because it has been really an incredible gift to have her here and to learn from her as she's navigating the thick of the translation of La Fine del Mundo. So La Fine del Mundo is a work that I had tried to translate small excerpts of into English myself in the context of my work, in my dissertation. It was around this ethnography that I am still doing of environmental crisis in southern Italy. And in fact, I arrived to my fieldwork via an engagement with deMartino's writing, which is kind of unusual. And ended up doing research in the region where he was doing fieldwork in the 1950s and 60s. So until now, yes, I was triangulating between the original Italian, this French translation that was published in 2016, and trying to come up with my own, quotes and so on. And so, of course, the work that you're doing now. Anyone who has read La Fine del Mundo can only imagine what a challenge this translation represents. And this is not only because of the plurality of languages that are being translated into citations within the text itself, but also because of the number of, as you were saying, Dorothy, the number of disciplines that one has to be able to cross and straddle. So from philosophy, psychiatry, literature, anthropology. And this is not even mentioning his style, which you can tell us about, but that is very literary, but also at times extremely complex. And one could even say that his writing is forged precisely by the diversity of languages and disciplines that he's reading. And this we will see also in certain specific examples here. So I will just say that the French edition involved approximately 5 translators, and that Dorothy is basically doing this on her own, this project, but of course in constant communication and contact, of course, with the Italian scholars, specialists of deMartino, philosophers and other anthropologists. So I had the chance, so we were able to meet over the past week, and she was telling me about all these different epistolary exchanges that she's been having with various people in order to make sure that, according to each person's specialty, that she's doing the right, choice and so on. So So we were able to meet over the past week, and we identified a few key moments that we can discuss with you. And you'll see that her translation really led her to do a lot of conceptual work, particularly in those instances where there are difficulties or resistances in the translation. And in a way, this translation allows us to understand it better. And that was already the case with the French translation in 2016 that then became the basis for the new edition of the Italian. So it's like every translation, I was still using until recently the 1977 original La Fine del Mundo, and the new version has been plasmated from the French choices and an editorial work that has been done in the past, 5 years or so, a bit more. So perhaps we could just start with a question, a very simple question. Dorothy, perhaps you could tell us why La Fine del Mundo is being published now and into English, and what were the challenges that you faced in bringing deMartino to the English-speaking world?
Yeah. Oh, okay. I'll just say a few things because I could really go on and on this topic. But first of all, I had the idea for translating this book before the pandemic. So just so everybody knows, it was like I was already developing the project and had this idea, etc. And then the pandemic hit, so it seemed even more appropriate. And then the war broke out, and now it's just it unfortunately is getting more and more appropriate. But it's again, I was inspired by the new edition because it's a work, as I said, that was a lot of folks were inspired by bits and pieces of it, but it was a book that kind of created problems in a way, and people didn't really know where to place it, you know, in his oeuvre, and but I think with the new edition, it is so much more organic, and I think it's friendlier to engage, and you know, so I think that it was a real game changer to have the new edition. A general comment: English language publishers are not very open to doing translations. It's very, very difficult to get a publisher to get interested and enthusiastic and say, yes, let's do this. You know, there's a definite imbalance in what happens in other places in the world, and the amount of stuff that gets translated from English into other languages, and this is not the same as, you know, in the other direction into English. So there's also a whole commercial / you know, publication market aspect, which makes things difficult. But so in general, it's not easy. But you know, I got inspired to do this, and yeah, so it's finally getting off the ground. I could say a lot more about the difficulties, but probably it'll come out.
I also wanted for you to talk a little bit about the role of deMartino in Italian anthropology, but also the kind of, there's been several articles that came out recently in Italian, one by Giovanni Pizza, Ernesto de Martino, Fuori di sé, in which he laments this missed encounter, this, you know, the gap in the intellectual legacy. Why has someone like Gramsci, for instance, been taken up by anthropologists abroad, while deMartino, who is an inheritor of Gramsci and actually committed to the discipline of anthropology, hasn't been? Why is he considered regionalized, while thinkers like Agamben have circulated and traveled differently, and so on? So basically, lamenting the fact that deMartino is seen as a native informant rather than a theorist.
Yeah,
that was kind of his. And you wrote a really interesting response to that. So I was wondering how you saw your translation participating in this debate also.
Yeah, you know, there's this whole geopolitical aspect to translation and language, and I feel a bit ambivalent in the sense that you know, translating into English on the one hand kind of feeds into the kind of hegemony of the English language in our discipline, but by the way, I really believe that the book will appeal to multiple disciplines, but of course I'm speaking as an anthropologist, so I tend to focus on that. There's a whole discourse now about world anthropologies, and I think deMartino, because he occupies such a huge position in Italian anthropology, as a representative, it's nice for him to get out there and get known. And he's been pigeonholed a bit too much as a kind of folklorist of Southern Italy, because he's focused on these topics that were folkloric. But as I explained, he comes at them in a completely different way. So yeah, there's this issue of the fact that whoever's outside, in the other areas, the non-hegemonic areas of the discipline worldwide, they're forced to have to know and engage with English language texts. But there's what's been called an imperial provincialism, where those who are in the hegemonic spot can afford to ignore things that are coming out of the other places. But I think that there's a really great conversation going on, especially like the Brazilians have been doing a lot, and in Latin America in general, and other places about world anthropology. So I think that it's interesting in anthropology per se. The works from Italians that have become really famous are precisely from philosophers like Agamben, Gramsci, the other one, that's the Marxist stuff, the former terrorist, what is his name?
Negri.
Yeah, thank you, Negri. Those are the ones who have like really, gotten huge names. So it is kind of weird that, well, why aren't anthropologists? And there was also a thing for many, many years that anthropologists doing work in Italy were not engaging in the in the works produced by Italian scholars, and this is again something that the Brazilian Association of Anthropology last year, they made a motion to protest this, saying, if somebody's going to do field work in a place, they should know and engage with local scholars and treat them, with this kind of respect.
So before we enter specific problems of translation, did you want to give us a little introduction to your approach to how to translate this kind of?
Okay, yeah, just a brief word. I mean, all of these points, of course, we'll be able to expand on them we wanted to leave a lot of time for discussion. So we'll just put out these bits. My approach, I don't consider myself a literary translator, and I feel that it's important to try to stick pretty close to the original. At the same time, there are things that need to be changed to make them more friendly for an English language reader. So these extremely long sentences with lots of subordinate clauses and stuff to, divide those up and make it a little bit friendlier for the English language reader. So that's something. So I try to stay pretty close to deMartino's original, in the sense that there are specific things like his use of gerunds, and which can be pretty substantial. And if it doesn't sound too bad in English, I like to keep there are a lot of times where I just feel like he made a choice, because there would have been another word in Italian, and if he chose that, then I should try to, understand why and respect that. On the other hand, there are a few things that I've changed. For example, there's a whole issue of gender. And it was typical of his period, and some people are still, I think, even now, not that many, but this use of the universal man thing. So I thought, okay, I have to address this because it can be a little jarring for today's reader. So I want it to be, the translation to be respectful and nonetheless not too irritating or jarring for today's reader. On the other hand, I don't want to whitewash deMartino and make him woke, which wouldn't be, also would be kind of weird. So I try to, where I think that he's using this man, uomo, in this kind of universalizing form as humanity, humankind, etc. I'm substituting it with humanity, humankind. On the other hand, if he's giving specific examples, the historian, the ethnologist, his blah blah and he blah blah, I'm using the universal male there, and that's the way it is. I figure it's not worth going that far. So, I'm meditating on all these choices and trying to. Okay.
So many choices along the way, and this one actually is another example of the kinds of choices that I found fascinating. So
yeah.
So we were talking about La Fine del Mundo itself as an act of translation, right? Because it's one of the most citational works of deMartino, I would say, right? It's not ethnographic per se, and he's bringing in texts from all these different authors in all these different languages and translating them, and through the translate, sometimes paraphrasing and not necessarily quoting, or just translating and not putting the quotation marks. And Dorothy was saying sometimes, I went back to the original and I had to actually see that he was basically, this is a quote, but he never put the quotation marks. He just translated it and kind of incorporated it in his writing, right? Whereas here, and so that's why, the enormous amount of work has been also to go and get the originals. And in this case, maybe you want to tell us what
Right.
this is.
Okay. Yeah, this was a huge issue about his citational approach, and so I've really been trying to clean that up, so to speak, and where I feel that he's citing very closely, make it very clear that it's a quotation, and also going back to the original to try to make it follow well. But this was one point that came up just the other day. And by the way, this is all work in progress. So if in the process of our discussion today, some people come up with great suggestions, I would be thrilled and I will incorporate them. But I was intrigued the other day, I just found this one. From Carl Jasper's General Psychopathology. The original by Jaspers uses this expression, bildhafte denken, which in the English translation of Jaspers, the official translation, is pictorial thinking. deMartino translates this into Italian as pensiero simbolico, symbolic thought. And I think that's an interesting slippage. And I think it also, and so what I found in a few cases, again, there's so many of these small things. If I went, documenting them and tried to trace them all, I think I would go nuts. But I really have the distinct feeling in a few cases that he tweaks the translation to his own ends. And in this case, the symbolic thought, this fits in really well with his emphasis on symbolism and symbols. So, it's a real subtle thing, but, Carl Jaspers could have written symbolische denken, if he wanted to, but he didn't. So there are little questions like that. What I decided to do was I'm citing it from the English translation of Jaspers, but I have a footnote pointing out that in the Italian, deMartino's saying symbolic thought, so that this is signposted for the reader.
No, I thought that example was also very interesting because, some people have written about the role of images, for example, in deMartino's work. And Dorothy was mentioning Morte Pianto Rituale, which has this atlas at the end. And several people have actually made the parallel between this atlas and Aby Warburg's Mnemosyne atlas and his work with images. However, deMartino, in his introduction to this atlas, is very reticent to say that he has any interest in images and, in fact, and the aesthetic more generally. And so, these moments, and this is a question, it's an open question, but those are moments for me which are interesting to see where translation actually opens up also some conceptual aspects for him, like the place of images in this case,
Yeah.
pictorial thinking versus symbolic.
deMartino was reading and translating from German very, very well. I mean, his German's better than mine, but I can see where there are a few discrepancies.
Go to the next
Mhm.
one. Ganz
Oh,
andere.
yeah. So this was something deMartino was really focused on this concept. So he discusses in several places here and other works, Rudolf Otto's notion of the holy other, holy with a WH, other as this kind of description from the phenomenological approach to religion of engaging the kind of mystical experience in engaging this holy other. And deMartino's always milling on this and kind of coming back to it. So there was this quotation when he was looking at the literature on schizophrenia and translating Wetzel's work in these case studies of schizophrenics. He really was emphasizing the ganz andere thing, which I don't know if Wetzel really intended it that way, but for deMartino it rang this Rudolf Otto bell. So he picked those out. I got the feeling he was kind of cherry picking, and then he leaves the German in there really to emphasize it. But there was one, it doesn't show up that well on the font. Okay, here it is. Yeah, there was a small discrepancy because there was one passage where it was ganz anders, and deMartino wrote ganz andere anyway. I mean, it's very, very close, but again, I think he was tweaking a little bit there. So.
No, but that's interesting in our conversation about this example. You were talking also about the repetition and rhythm in deMartino's mode of writing.
Yeah.
And here it's interesting that he chooses to leave this term untranslated, but in italics, there is a lot of that in the text. And why does he choose this one rather than another
Yeah.
and to use it in repetition? And a lot of his, at least philosophical concepts, you were saying also, it's like they arrive through appositions with commas, and it's like this proliferation of words, and often with words that are untranslated as a kind of a combination of words, and through this finding a concept. No?
Yeah, this kind of layering or weaving his text through this kind of repetition.
Do you have an idea of why certain words are left in the original in terms of?
Well, we'll get to the one about Heinrich. That's a biggie, so maybe we should just.
Yes. So this is an excerpt from Stork and Kuhlenkampf's. It's an essay by two Swiss psychiatrists who are writing about a young peasant, a young farmer, 23 years old, who has this schizophrenic delirium in which he has this vision of the end of the world that is represented as trees being uprooted from the land and the world, the underworld, kind of gushing out of these holes. And so deMartino is quoting the patient's words.
So you have there's an interesting layer, many layers here of translation, because you have Storch and Kuhlenkampf, who interviewed the patient as psychiatrists, and they are reporting the case and they report the words of the patient. And deMartino, who then translates this into Italian. And but what struck me, so the original in German, they're talking to the patient and saying, he keeps repeating about how everything is out of place and in the wrong place, etc. And they're saying, well, when are things going to be okay? And when are you going to be able to save the people who have fallen into the underworld? And he says, I translated it as when I'm home again, in a pretty literal translation of German, when I'm home again. deMartino translates it, it says, this will happen when I found once again found my familiar world. So it's really, again, kind of tweaking.
And so it's interesting because here you have two different choices, like in the French, as modes or strategies of translating, the French decided to stay somewhat close to deMartino's interpretation, basically. He's translating, but he's also interpreting, because he could have said casa mia, or he could have said, right, he could have said another word that's more close to home, but he chose mondo familiare. And in the French, they kept the monde. But you chose to go closer to the original German.
Again, it's just my provisional choice. I mean, this could change, but I felt that, going back to the original. But yeah, I guess it shows this, because this whole thing, and we'll get to that, there's a whole bunch of words around this root of world that fit into this book. And I think maybe deMartino wanted to emphasize that, in the experience, the collapse of the world for the schizophrenic in this case.
So now we'll look at some specific terms.
Okay, so a general comment, Jasmine and I picked out a few of the specific terms, a few of the many specific terms that I've been banging my head about. And several of these are related to the work of Martin Heidegger. And so now this is a real bind, okay, because on the one hand, how closely should I follow English translations of Heidegger? How closely should I not? And deMartino is using a very Heideggerian lexicon in this book. And I mean, I knew it, but when you're working on a translation and you're seeing word by word what's going on, you're like, wow. So even things that I didn't catch initially, along the way, I'm realizing that they are definitely from Heidegger. And so at the same time, deMartino is not receiving Heidegger passively. He has his own kind of voice that he's inserting into Heidegger's specific language. So it's a real challenge to try to render that, use of Heidegger, the indebtedness to Heidegger, and at the same time, his innovations on Heidegger. So this thing about spaisato, spaisamento, appaisato is a good example of this.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the reasons I had picked this term, or I had kind of fixated on it, because I was trying to translate it in my dissertation. And one of the reasons is because there's the word landscape in there. There's the word, so spaisamento paese can be country or village, but paesaggio is landscape in Italian. And French has a similar one, paysage, dépaysement, is this idea, this disorientation that is connected to the landscape, right? And this was because I was working specifically on environmental issues and the connection with the land, and so I thought that was an interesting point of interaction with what I was looking at ethnographically. But and I remember asking Dorothy, how did you, how are you going at it?
Okay, so I really, this was probably one of the biggest sticklers, and I've been, circling around it. So we have to keep in mind that spaisato, spaisamento, etc. in Italian, in the translations of Heidegger, it's referring to the uncanny. That's how it's rendered in English, uncanny. My first reaction to spaisato in kind of common use of Italian would be like disorientation, disoriented, etc. Or maybe even alienation. But you have to keep in mind this relationship to unheimlich. And unheimlich also relates to Unheimlichkeit, Heim, this idea of home, again, from Heidegger, which is really important. On the other hand, one of the innovations that deMartino makes is a kind of inverse, a positive proposal here. So it's not just the negative spaisato, spaisamento, but there's also a positive process of this. And this that I tried in many, many ways, I kind of came to the idea that maybe a good solution could be settled for a paesare, because unsettling works well as a kind of synonym for uncanny. And that's why I like that. And I also like the fact that this idea of settled can be on different levels. It can be on your intimate domestic level, but it can be on, there's a kind of scalar flexibility there that I like. Whereas if you choose solutions that are more like focused on the domestic or homeliness, et cetera, it's harder to stretch that out to the broader scales. But, you know, I'll be interested maybe in the discussion, we can get some opinions on this. I've consulted several colleagues about this, and they all seem to like the settle and unsettling solution. But that's, again, just one.
And it's really curious that Freud doesn't really appear at all.
It's not.
The uncanny. In fact, in some places, I think you did use the uncanny, but it's always this idea that it's via Heidegger, right?
That's another point. Thanks for mentioning that. So I also think that it's not necessary to be, you know, completely rigid about this. That is, it's possible that one word, the same word in deMartino, can be translated in different ways in different contexts. And I think that, you know, in the end, if I really decide, yes, this is it, what I'm going for, you know, I might use uncanny in some contexts, and in other contexts, this unsettling, et cetera. But, you know, this, and also for some of the other words, I think that it's not necessary, like oltrepassare. I decided in some cases to use it as overcoming, in other cases transcending. So it's, yeah, I think that's also, it's not always a binary thing. It's possible to have multiple solutions.
So these were examples.
Yes, it's a bit more on this.
Yeah,
I
mean, this example is interesting just because you have spaesato here in the original. It says, per i malati questo è non familiare, spaesato unheimlich. C'è qualcosa che, so he's kind of translating there himself in a way, right? He's saying, glossing, like, okay, this is kind of an equivalent. And in French, they said pas familier unheimlich, and then here uncanny, but you have a footnote here, right?
That's the official translation from Karl Jaspers in English. Yeah, so the translation of Jaspers uses uncanny, but that's commonly the translation for unheimlich. Okay, so again, this is another toughie. There are many words that revolve around this idea, this kind of nucleus about world, mondo. So we have mondano, mondanita, and deMartino talks about a process of demondanizzazione, which is also a tough one. So how to render this? Well, in Heidegger, there's a lot of talk about Weltheit, which would be the mondanita, and the classic translation of Heidegger, the Macquarie and Robinson, uses worldness. A more recent translation by John Stambaugh uses worldliness. So yeah, I'm looking into all kinds of options basically, and again, I'm consulting people from, for example, for these kinds of things, a friend who's a philosopher and who's worked extensively on deMartino and Heidegger, and so. But again, there are things that are still open to a definitive solution. And another tough one, again, related to Heidegger, deMartino uses this term very often, utilizzabile or utilizzazione, in a noun form. The utilizzabile is a rendering of, in Italian, of Heidegger's Zuhanden or Zuhandenes, and the other word being Zuhandenheit. And the classic translation in English of Heidegger talks about ready to hand, readiness to hand, which I think sounds horrible, but that's the canonical translation of Heidegger. So I'm looking at possibly adopting the Stambau translation, which is a little bit friendlier, the something at hand or thing at hand and handiness as alternatives. And finally, there are projectare, projectazione, projectabile. There are many words that deMartino is using around this root of project. And again, it can sound a bit awkward in English, but there definitely is a sense that he's talking about Entwurf and Antwerpen from Heidegger. So, that has to somehow fit in. I don't want to mess with that too much. I mean, I like the idea of that root of project being in there, even if it's a little bit awkward in some cases. By the way, I am going to put a glossary in the translation. So I think a lot of these choices, I think that it's important just to share with the reader my choices and make it transparent. And then the reader can also have his or her own opinion. It's just, I think I'd like to make some of this a bit transparent, why there are some of these terms that are a bit clumsy or awkward.
I think that maybe we should open it up for
Okay.
questions now. And there was this one passage, we can talk about it if it comes up in the discussion later. We had just left a bit of time to read passages that we enjoyed of the book, but I think it would be good to privilege maybe questions from
Yes,
the audience.
I think
just
let's
have
leave a lot of space to questions and discussion.
If you have a question in the audience, I will trouble you to step up to this device with the glowing eyes. Speak right into it if you have a question in the audience.
And will you, we see if there are questions in the chat, and then we can call on.
Oh yeah, the chat, that's right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna let people gather their thoughts and invite you all to do that and ask questions, because I have lots and lots of them, but I'm gonna limit myself to one and take the prerogative of the host and ask you a little bit about a question that you formulated, Jasmine, to Dorothy, as why translate deMartino, this deMartino now? And you had started with the sense that there is something in the content or the referent of the text or the trunk, the motive force of the text that makes it feel contemporary.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes sense to me in lots of ways, although I'm not sure. I imagine that one could probably find pretty much in any moment in time a sensation somewhere that the end is nigh, or at least things are bad. So I was wondering a little bit about the kind of the literary context within which a work like this that you describe as so fragmentary, so suffused with translation, citation. So, what makes that kind of a book receivable now in a new way, and what made it receivable in the late 70s? And it just strikes me that genre, that there is now a genre form of a certain kind of massive fragmentary work. The Besazenwerke, the Benjamin that comes to us, or kind of, indeed the kind of growing status of Benjaminian practice, allows for us to think that this is a book and not merely an archive of notes for what might have become a book. And I was, is that part of what makes this legible now as an intellectual work that in another moment might just have seemed like a package of notations, not yet of the order book? I mean, I don't know how complete you think it was, or whether you imagine this being in conversation with that kind of work, which is both fragmentary in form and theological or metaphysical or philosophical in ambition.
Yeah, I always compared it to Gramsci's Prison Notebooks, because again, another work that's fragmentary and yet has offered so much inspiration. But yes, I think you're absolutely right. Like Benjamin and other examples. Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, already the work had inspired a lot of people, even in the old edition. I mean, there are passages that are just really famous in Italian anthropology. But I think that the editors for the new edition, they basically they made an editorial decision to take out things that were simply transcriptions or translations that deMartino made without adding his own commentary. So they jettisoned a good part of stuff, and then they reorganized a few things. They also incorporated some material from his philosophical writings that weren't in some of the original folders, but they fit in very, very well. So I think their arguments are very good to make this more cohesive. And yeah, I think it works, but you're right that it could be that there's a broader change in the reception of this kind of text that makes it feasible, that makes it work. I hadn't thought about that. I was just so enthusiastic about the work per se when I saw the new edition. I mean, I knew the classic passages of the old edition, but I just felt that, yeah, now it was much more user-friendly. The editors had put in very, very extensive commentary for each chapter, each section, and so you know, that also helped. Yeah, maybe the time is ripe also in terms of the audience reception for a work that, again, it is a reconstruction. We won't know 100%, but deMartino had a pretty clear idea of how he wanted the book, and so there are a few points that are definitely you know, fixed points in this that you say, yes, this is definitely something that would have been pretty much in toto in the actual book. The other thing that Jasmine and I were talking about was interesting is how, and it's also wonderful that you can see in some places here, deMartino kind of hammering out a concept, that he's making a couple of attempts at defining something. And so the inclusion of some of those things, for example, there was that passage where he did it in 3 drafts, and in the new edition, it's only 1 draft, the thing about the heart. You know, so in some cases, they jettisoned other versions, but in many cases, you find bits where he's coming at something from a slightly different angle. And so it's also fascinating to see a kind of process of deMartino trying to hammer out his ideas. So in that sense, it's an interesting kind of insight or tool in its fragmentary nature.
I also wonder whether the readership would be the same in Italy and here. Like, for example, this notion that the fragmentary work, maybe in a more literary milieu, would be of interest. I have a feeling, and maybe I'm wrong, but that Italy, deMartino is more read in anthropology.
Well,
right? I mean, he's
Widely read in
widely,
philosophy and also, I mean, literary studies. I think he's kind of all over the place, but
right.
no, he's very widely read.
Have you had some
History.
returns from, let's say, the press on why do you think Chicago University Press was interested in that moment? Like, what is it about that? Did they
One
choose
thing
Land of
that-
Remorse?
No, I proposed it to them. They have in their list, they have the works of Mercé Eliade. And I think they liked to put, you know, it's like Cassius Clay, and you know, it's like having two heavyweights, you know, sparring or something. So I think that's why they kind of like the idea, that they had the proposal out for review, et cetera, and it's not like they just signed on to it, you know.
Dave, would you like to, and then Georgia?
Do I need to go? Yes, please, sorry.
Thank you.
Let's sit here. So, my question relates more to the translatability to other contexts, so to other countries. And the context that I know best is Portugal, and particularly northern Portugal, which might be, I don't know, correlate with the southern Italy, and particularly around this question of crisis of presence, and in relation even to the idea of death and the lament. It strikes me that the context of northern Portugal around death fits very much an Heideggerian idea of the being towards death.
Mhm.
That is to say, the being that tends towards death but never coincides with it, because by the time that you die, you're not there to even to witness that you coincide with it, right? And so I guess the first part of my question is the question of translatability to other contexts, to other, other places, perhaps within Southern Europe, whether you could say something about that. But then also, it's talking particularly in relation to the question of the lament, because so in northern Portugal, you have these very strong ideas of the good death, boa morte. And there is this phenomenon of the carpideiras, which is to say women who are hired to cry for, during funerals. And so, and they are hired to cry precisely, because of that idea that of the being towards death. So they are hired to cry in order to let this, the death to be present. See, because those who don't have people who cry for them, they become these errant souls. They're still not coinciding with your own death, right? So I was wondering if you could compare, like, where the temporality of the lament, like is the lament something that goes on, like way after the person died, or is that lament that is there in order to make the death to happen, right? The person to coincide, the presence of death, right? So the person to coincide with his or her own death.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Let me start with that right away. The thing about lament and death, and maybe Georgia, I discovered, Georgia Mirto is working on these issues and engaging the deMartino's work on ritual lament. It seems like your question, you're dealing more from the perspective of the person who's dying, right?
Mm-hmm.
What deMartino is focusing on is not that. He's focusing on everybody else, the survivors, who are going into a crisis because they've lost the loved one. And so what he says is that the ritual helps them move out of that crisis and move back into the possibility of agency, of being in history. And one of the things he says is that they make, like, somebody dies, but they haven't really died yet until the people make them die culturally with these rituals.
Right. This is also what I'm saying.
Yeah, I knew there was a point of contact there.
Yeah.
But he's focusing much more on the perspective of the other people, not the person who's experiencing the death.
Mm-hmm.
So that was for that. In terms of the translatability to other contexts, well, first of all, this book is not really focused on Southern Italy at all, except in a couple of passages, he introduces an ethnographic example from his work, etc. But it's moving on a completely different level. It's global. It's moving through history. So he's aiming for, it's really a kind of philosophical anthropology. He's really aiming for a theorization about being and yeah, and culture, and what is culture, and yeah, so in terms of that, you know, it could be potentially very translatable.
Thank you.
Joseph, and then we will take our question from the Zoom.
Please step right up to the
Here?
device.
Here?
Exactly, yes, and just loud and clear into the device.
All right. I see your extreme generosity in your work today, and I know your work so far, and it was a pleasure hearing you and hearing like your generosity towards deMartino and sharing deMartino with the rest of the world, who was somehow hidden, and also it was his success in Italy itself was quite fluctuating, as you show us. And in your generosity, I saw also your approach in translating those words, using the original. So not following the own deMartinian translation, but trying to understand where deMartino took those words. And I'm thinking about like the pensiero simbolico, which is quite an important word for deMartino, and you decided to use the original, another approach, if as far as I remember, or there was a couple of examples in your speech in which I saw like a different kind of care for deMartino. For example, when you translate man with uomo with humanity, a kind of care of deMartino to adapt his work in more current for a more current reader, and also maybe a more current source approach. So I just if you can unpack a bit more about what actually motivates your choice of deciding to use the original rather than use the deMartinian changing of the original.
Yeah. No.
And as the question that Professor Abreu did, I think that there's quite the urgency to translating Lamento Funebre then, because it's something that is, I don't want to suggest you anything, you know, and also you're just working on another book, so probably you will take a rest after this book. But
my sabbatical will be over, so.
But definitely, in a kind of very egoistic reason, Lamento Morte Pianto Rituale is now then, with all the way in which Italy today is facing the death. In my case, it's the death of migrants in the south of Italy, and those who die trying to cross the EU external border, but actually also the recent phenomenon of COVID in the North Italy is a kind of text that has been picked up, at least in Italy. And maybe I think that would be a kind of useful tool for a broader anthropology of that. So I wish that someday someone will adventure in this translation.
Yeah, I'd like to say that you know, some people do Sudokus as a hobby, and my hobby has been translating deMartino, because the other two books I did were pure labors of love, you know, like in the evening after dinner, sitting at the computer again, and working for a few hours, you know, but this was so big that I had to really dedicate my whole sabbatical year to it. But yeah, sooner or later, I hope to get to Morte Pianto Rituale. There's also kind of argument amongst colleagues in Italy of, you know, which is their favorite. And a lot of people were already grumbling that I did this and not in Mondo Magico as a retranslation. So, you know, you can't make everyone happy. Now, about the choices, about the originals, etc. I already did this a lot. It was much more present in the Parentism book, the Land of Remorse, than in the Sude Magia, deMartino's citations of other authors. And so I had to make these kinds of decisions already. And if he's citing somebody, quoting them where there's already an existing English version, I use that. And that was always my approach. If there's not, I mean, it just didn't make sense to me to translate from his Italian something that's already existing in English because it was originally in English, or because, for example, Freud, or it was from the original German or French or whatever, Latin and Greek in the case of that book, too, translated into Italian, and then another step into English that seemed to me to not make sense. And it turns out that University of Chicago Press, I already had that approach, but they put it into the contract that I need to use original sources when available, original English sources. So that explains, that choice. But like I said, I think, for example, that the issue of pensiero simbolico, it's good to just make that visible to the reader with a footnote and say, this is, and then the reader can do whatever he or she wants with that. So yeah, so that's what is going on with the originals. And I've spent a lot of time and energy tracking down these originals, in some cases having to deal with multiple translations. So there's the chapter with a lot of literary sources. He has we were talking about this the other day, in another chapter, in chapter 7, reciting Proust. There are multiple translations of Proust. And in fact, interestingly, it's my colleagues in Italy have commented that deMartino's translation of Proust in those passages is better than Natalia Ginsburg's translation of Proust, which, is really astonishing. But for my purposes, do I use the Moncrief or do I use the more recent one? So it requires a lot of decision making. And when I did La Terra del Rimorso, he cites a passage from Tris Tropique. There were 3 translations of Tris Tropique. I looked at all 3 of them and thought about this before deciding which to use. I mean, it gets, and it's a huge amount of work, but that's what I'm doing.
Yes. So the first question from Joseph Scomi, from who's watching us on Zoom. Thanks so much for this. I have a question regarding the layers of quote originals in the various translations and how you're dealing with them in the text you're writing. As a historian, I wonder how you account for that passage from the original quotations or concepts to deMartino's text, and eventually to your interpretation of his text. Is there something lost with regard to context and interpretation in going back, as it were, to the original? Do you, as a translator, account for this temporal distance in notes? I say this because I wonder how much of the originality of deMartino's thinking comes from his imprecise rendering of others' scholarship, and he says in parentheses, perhaps something more scholars should embrace.
Wow, that's a really great question. Again, Jasmine and I, in our preparatory meetings, we were talking about the many rabbit holes of this project, and you can get really lost in questions like that. And right now, I feel like it's a marathon, and I just really need to get this done. And I have to do an introductory essay, the glossary, notes, etc. So there are many aspects to the project. How much I will be able to render exactly these tensions between originals and what deMartino's version of them are, I don't know. In a few cases, I've picked up on it, and I'm trying to signpost it where I can. But it's not easy. I mean, there are a lot of passages, and there are sometimes very subtle differences or subtle. I like what you said about imprecise rendering, etc. Yeah, it can definitely add a lot. Maybe it's my job to put it out there and let other people decide. I'm just trying to make it accessible. I don't know how much I can do, but you know, at one point I just have to say it is what it is and let go of it because of time constraints, logistical constraints. But and I believe the name is Josephine. If you have suggestions, you're welcome to write an email and we can, you know, dialogue about this. I'm completely open to suggestions about this issue.
So, thank you.
Step right up.
Sorry. It's a follow-up on that, actually. Sorry. It's a follow-up on that, on what Giorgio asked. And it's, so, you don't have to answer this. If I wonder if in your discussions, in your discussions or in other moments in your work on it, if you could take off the hat of the translator whose role, as you say, is to render it accessible in English to a crowd with all that comes with it, if you can give us a couple of examples of other choices you would have made, or of other sources that you discovered in this week that, you know, you working on it, but not needing to produce an authorized translation, would have gone elsewhere, where in these kind of paths that are opening, could you give us an example of a couple of alternatives?
Yeah. Well, I think in some of these Heideggerian terms, you know, we were showing you this kind of thing. I like the approach in the Macquarie and Robinson translation of Being and Time, that they do make their choices very visible in the notes. And they say that, you know, this could render it better in English. On the other hand, you lose that nuance, and you know, they justify their choices very, very nicely. And so I like that as a possibility, but yeah, you said I didn't have to answer the question, really, so maybe I'll go off with that option.
But maybe one thing we could say is that, I mean, just the inheritance of deMartino, there is a certain, I wouldn't say fear to experiment, but in a way we did mention this because you said, at certain times you said, you know, I want to take the dust off of him a little bit, and or I want to, you know, I want to, or there's some concepts that are coming out like the worlding, and so it's like newer
This is a good
strands in anthropology that in some way seem to be equivalents or in conversation with he was writing at the time, but there's the risk of forcing that, and that also what will be the reception in Italy of these moves. So there's, I think that's hard, and your position as a translator is kind of protected in that way, because what's going to happen once it is translated in English, and people might use some conceptual, you know, crisis of presence here and there, and you know, it gives it a whole.
I just want to mention, like, how many Italian colleagues have griped about how Gramsci's been used in the Anglophone world, and so there was a whole kind of rediscovery of Gramsci in more recent years, sparked a bit by the interest that had come up in the Anglophone world, but a lot of people were griping, like, you know, oh, they're not really using Gramsci properly, and it, you know, it could definitely happen. There's a risk of that with deMartino. You get it out there, and then people will. I mean, obviously, language lends itself to such ambiguities and things that interpretations, multiple interpretations, and we'll see what happens with it. But I have to see how much I can take on also in the introductory essay to deal with these issues.
I think we have one more question on Zoom, and I have one last
Okay.
question. And we're getting close to our closure, unless there are people in the room who wish to speak. Do you want to read it?
Yes, so it's from Ava Tomasura Garcia. Thank you so much. Can you speak more about what you called the comparison of deMartino's history of, quote, cultural apocalypse for Christian eschatology, Marxist apocalypse, etc., to, quote, psychopathological apocalypse, in parentheses, embodied illnesses.
Mhm.
What is the nature of the relationship? Is it a relationship of comparison, of co-constitution, or something else?
This is exactly the question that deMartino was tackling with the book, basically. He said that it was necessary to bring in the psychopathological apocalypses as a comparative counterweight to the cultural apocalypses and try to understand. You know, deMartino gets again to his theorization of being and culture. And one thing that he was very clear on was that there's a big difference between the psychopathological apocalypse in terms of how it's experienced by the individual, although there are superficial similarities in a lot of ways with the end of the world in existentialist literature, for example. That's one example that he goes into a lot, or millenarian movements, etc. In fact, he criticizes Wilhelm Mühlmann, who had the theory that some of these leaders of millenarian movements were schizophrenic, or, you know, mentally disturbed. And deMartino says, no, they weren't. You know, they were reacting to colonialism, basically. But one other big difference is that the sufferer of these psychopathological apocalypses don't have the tools of culture to overcome them. And ritual, symbols, etc., culture is exactly one of the things that keeps us, you know, going and with our presence and anchors us in that domesticity, the world, etc., through shared intersubjective cultural experience, the inheritance of tradition too. That's another thing. And so in this sense, he's also really like overturning Heidegger, who sees, you know, the inauthentic as the man in the crowd, you know, the das Man, you know, we amongst the they. And deMartino says, no, it's in that they, it's in the intersubjective social existence that we have our authenticity. If not, we go off the deep end. And I think, you know, a lot of what we saw with pandemic, et cetera, you know, kind of illustrates that. So I don't know if I answered the question thoroughly, but deMartino was grappling precisely with this comparison. And he saw that one of the problems in Western civilization and our crisis, which has been going on for over a century in Western culture, also due to the fact that we've lost a lot of these, we've lost our religion, you know, we've lost a lot of the mechanisms, the cultural mechanisms for, let's say, protecting, maintaining, or recovering when necessary our presence. Yeah, so I hope that's sufficient.
Can I ask a quick follow-up to that? Just thinking about to what
I think you need to go to the.
sorry. Yeah, to what extent was he ever really like in conversation, or I guess specifically with Land of Remorse, was he in conversation with like people studying, like psychiatrists, psychologists, people studying psychopathology? Because I think he had Yehoyada was on one of his. Yeah, and like what other. But that was like he was with him in the south, right? On Expedizione. But like, what about while he's writing this book? Is he?
This book draws heavily on psychiatric literature and psychology
In Italy? Or
in general.
okay.
It's not you know, located. He's looking at. I mean, obviously, single studies were located in single places. A lot of it's the German literature. But he's also interested in Pierre Janet, for example. Pierre Janet was extremely influential on deMartino's thinking, like this whole idea of presence comes also from Pierre Janet.
We're getting to the point that we should close. I have one last question for you, and you may choose to respond, both of you, because you both read deMartino in Italian, and you experience that writing in relationship to all the other writing that you know from that world. But what I hear you describing is a text that is grappling with radical forms of alienation, displacement, and so forth. And then you have a translational practice that emphasizes the accessibility, the friendliness, the desire for a kind of a relatively easy assimilation of this text. But when you read deMartino in Italian, in relationship to Italian, is the sense of alienation, does it have as a corollary an aesthetic of for lack of a better word, alienation, unease, estrangement, and so forth? You know, reading Heidegger, I mean, Heidegger is hard in German. No German philosopher thinks that, you know, it could become handy. And so I'm just curious whether when you read that text, does the text itself partake of the crisis or the dis-ease that is its object? And if so, does that enter into the question of how to translate it? Is there a virtue in holding open or at a distance the possibility of access? I mean, obviously no one wants an impossible translation, but I mean, I'm always interested in this. Can one translate difficulty?
I think even with my translation and my efforts to make it friendly, it's still not going to be, you know, yeah. I still think it's and not all of it is that heavy. I mean, of course, a lot of it is this focus on getting into again, there are also these kind of really positive, shining moments where he talks about ethnographic humanism, you know, and there are also, you know, more positive things, and I like to look at that. And so, but so I don't think that it necessarily has to. I mean, I understand what you're saying. It could be that kind of a certain roughness it's the medium is the message, right? But it's still going to be difficult.
Yeah, I have a hard time answering the question because, well, the edition I was working with was the 1977 one, which is much more, it's much less even accessible because it's, for example, one of the passages I was trying to translate, it's the first draft, second draft, third draft. So he's repeating several times the same paragraph, a little tweak here, a little difference here. So I chose one version that I quite liked, and then I tried to incorporate the parts of the other drafts in it and made my own, you know, and I put the brackets, you know, but then, you know, alongside that, I was reading the Ethnografía del Tarantismo Pugliese, which is all the transcriptions of the notebooks of 1959 of deMartino in Puglia. So it's, you know, it's notes and notes and notes, and, you know, I was just plunging into that. So for me, deMartino, it's always been this kind of archival world, and I quite appreciate that about it. So, but it's even if it's you know, it's made easier to read, it still stays. I mean, it still stays very much like that. So
Yeah,
it's it would take a lot to make it really accessible, I think.
yeah. I'm not dumbing it down. That's
No, I
that's for sure.
wasn't suggesting dumbing it down. Not at all. Anyways, we are at the limit of our time. I want to thank you both so much for sharing this with us in this incredibly open and generous way. It's very rare that people share work. It's in progress in this manner, and it's been lovely. And thank you to the Society of Fellows, the Haven Center. Thank you to the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life, Comparative Literature and Society, Anthropology, and all of you.
Thank you, everybody. And I'm really excited if anybody wants to contact me by email, etc. You know, you can work your name into the acknowledgements page of the translation. If you give me some interesting solutions.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.